For as long as I can remember, I have been fortunate to be able to occasionally join with a local theater company and act in a play or a musical. Many of you were able to see me recently in the Wichita Symphony's combined production with Music Theater of Wichita of Carousel. And then the weekend after that, I performed in Signature Theater's production of A Man of No Importance. Now, I agreed to take on these projects because when I was approached about them, I was on my Christmas break from Phillips. And I had some free time in the evenings. And sure, I could make it fit if the producers didn't mind working around my upcoming trip to Nicaragua and the beginning of my final semester. Oy. I'm delighted that I was able to do these two projects, but in hindsight, don't I already have enough on my plate? What is wrong with me that I just couldn't enjoy a few nights off? I suppose it is the same drive that has led me to pursue a seminary degree while working full-time with this congregation and singing in the choir and serving on three nonprofit community boards and still finding time to ride my bike and take care of my dogs and my family. I'll say it again. Oy. But I love this work more than anything I've ever done in my life. Working with this congregation is a journey that is showing me what it really means to live in community with others. And for that, I am profoundly and eternally grateful. But back to the theater. If you've ever been involved with any kind of theatrical project, you know we have to set the stage. We have to build a set, we have to paint it, we have to find props and costumes. We have to deal with all of these preliminary steps before we can present the drama to an audience. And that's what we're up to here today. We're setting the stage for the great drama that is to come. Holy Week, all of that drama, the crucifixion of Christ, and then the magnificent drama of Easter morning. We are contemplating what life might have been like in first century Palestine, and we're setting the stage for the upcoming Christ event. We're dusting off our imaginations and we're flexing our empathy muscles as we try to imagine what it might have been like way back then, 2,000 years ago. I have chosen two scriptures to bookend our work here this morning. They're both in your bulletin, one from 2 Chronicles and one from 1 Timothy. Now, I chose these particular verses because as far as we can determine, they are the last verses of the Hebrew Bible, those 2 Chronicle verses that made it into the canon, that is, the approved books of what became the Bible. And then the 1 Timothy words are believed to be the earliest of Apostle Paul's writings about the Christ event, that those were then canonized, were made official. So these two sets of scripture create a frame around the Christ event of antiquity. I printed these verses in your bulletins, the 2 Chronicles being the last words of the Hebrew Bible, written roughly 300 or 400 years before the birth of Jesus. And then the words of Paul, writing in roughly the year 50 or 51 after the birth of Jesus. So Jesus' life and ministry happens between those two verses that you have in your bulletins this morning. Now, mind you, every scholar has a different idea and different methods for determining the dates of these documents. I've used the most common modern dating of those documents and some consensus on where those books fall. I wanted to use those two passages to frame our thoughts about what life might have been for a human being living in this context in first century Palestine, just before this disruptive Jewish preacher named Jesus shows up on the scene. I'm setting the stage for us. So let's look at the 2 Chronicles text for just a minute. We are given in that text great hope. But we're also given the tension of a clear distinction between certain classes of Jewish leaders. Primarily, we're given a distinction between the priestly caste and the more inclusive Levite caste. That is, we're given the division of the authority by the priest who is in the temple and the authority of the people by means of being of the tribe of Levi and ultimately all Jewish persons. Now, you can't make those distinctions from the few lines that I printed. This is an overarching theme, though, of 2 Chronicles. Us versus them. The priest as authority figure versus the entire group of Jewish people that have the authority to determine the fate of the covenant of Israel. Now, does that sound a little familiar to your ears? It should. It could be argued that the Protestant Reformation came out of a similar conflict. The authority of the Church of Rome versus the priesthood of all believers. So we got that, 2 Chronicles over here. And then we put the 1 Thessalonian letter on the other side of the life of Jesus. Now, it was written about 20 years after the crucifixion. And Paul was not an eyewitness, and there's no evidence that Paul ever met Jesus. So we've got that separation there as well. And we get another division in Paul's letter, that of traditional Jewish community, and then we've got this burgeoning new group of folks that are following this new Messiah, what we call the Christ movement. So the Apostle Paul is writing to a newly formed church up in Thessalonica. Thessalonica was the capital of the province of Macedonia and a very large seaport. And this letter, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, is thought to have been written by Paul from Corinth just a very few months after he founded a congregation up in the north. So back down to the south. What was first century Palestine like? I don't know. But we have some really, really good ideas from the existing written and archaeological record. We're pretty confident of a few things. Here's one of them. This part of the world during this time period was Hellenized. No, that doesn't mean that Helen had any influence. I was trying to think of a way to make a joke about that. No, if it was Hellenized, this means that it was greatly influenced by all things Greek. And why is this? Well, I just mentioned Thessalonica, and that it was the capital of the province of Macedonia, and Alexander the Great was from Macedonia, which was a large part of northern Italy. And hopefully we all know what made Alexander great, right? What he accomplished in his short life. He conquered the known world. And what do conquerors do? They remake the world in their own image. Through the processes of imperialism and colonialism, they cause the cultures of the areas that they conquered to assimilate and become like the conqueror. In this case, Alexander made his conquered territories Greek. How many Alexandrias did he either found or rename? I believe there's 12 of them throughout the places that Alexander conquered. So in this case, he made all of his conquered territories Greek, and by the time of Jesus, which is a few hundred years after this, Koine Greek, a very specific type of Greek, Koine Greek, was the common tongue, the lingua franca of the known world. A lingua franca is a language that is extremely common. Today we would probably call English the lingua franca of the world, because during the time that the British Empire was conquering the world, you see a theme here as empires rise and fall and rise and fall. As they were conquering the world, they made its language English, the language that was used in law and commerce, trade, art, all of those things. So it eventually became the language that everyone had to learn so you could participate in the day-to-day affairs of the world. I'll ask you, why do the people of India, most of them, speak two languages? Well, because for a long time, India was part of the British Empire. Why do we still have enclaves here in the United States where French is predominantly spoken? Think of parts of Louisiana. Because for many years, France was a ruling power on this continent. Language has a power of its own. And we could spend a lifetime studying the effects of imperialism and colonialism on indigenous populations and never arrive at satisfactory reasons for why language assists the conquering empire in its aims of hegemony. That is, how an empire assimilates lesser nations, states, and people and turns them into something that resembles the conqueror, thereby losing the story of the conquered people. It's buried under imperialism. So, Palestine had been Hellenized. And I know what you're all thinking, right? That Thessalonica is miles north of Palestine. I'll get there. Okay. Now remember, though, the entire known world was mostly Hellenized, was Greek in culture. So, let's add something else to this. We're dealing with Jewish people in Palestine, that Jesus was born into a Jewish world, and Paul as well. So Paul, who wrote his letter to Thessalonica, he was a Jew. And we know that he was a Jew from his own admission in his letters. He was a Jew living in a culture and a society that was heavily influenced by the Greeks. In fact, while Paul and Jesus would have spoken the languages of their families and their tribes in the region, Aramaic and Hebrew, Paul would have used Koine Greek to write to his newly formed churches, because that was the language that everyone used. Paul was a Jewish man living in a highly Greek-influenced society. That's complicated. And now we're going to add something else major to our first century Palestine mix. In 63 BCE, that is 63 years before the Common Era or the Christ event, the Romans had successfully invaded this part of the world, and they had established rule under Roman authority and occupation. Now we have really complicated matters for Jesus and then Paul and their followers in their lives, haven't we? We're in a part of the world that was not that long ago ruled by Jewish kings who were allowed to keep their thrones as long as they obeyed either the Babylonian, the Persian, or the Greek imperial masters. We don't have time this morning to go into the Babylonian history, but just know that it had a great effect on this region as well. So, Jewish kings ruling as puppets of the Greek or Babylonian Empire are then pushed aside for government by the Romans. And of course, we know many of them did get to keep their positions under the Romans. All right, what's all this for? Jesus came into a world of great complexity and great tension. Jews who were greatly influenced by Greek philosophy, think Plato and Aristotle, and Greek law and society and art and writing, are now being ruled by Rome. Now, one thing we do know about the Romans, they were pragmatic world conquerors. And they believed, honestly, that they were the race chosen by the gods to do that, to rule the world. And the Romans practiced a pragmatic philosophy they called syncretism. What syncretism basically is this. Once Rome conquered a people or a nation, they installed their puppet governments, but they basically left that region alone. And I'll get to why. They installed governors who were loyal to Rome. Think Herod and his family. Herod and all the Herods were Jews, but obviously fiercely loyal to Rome. And as long as that region or province would do two things, they were pretty much left well enough alone to run their day-to-day affairs as they saw fit. And here are the two things they had to do. Money had to flow back to the treasury in Rome. Money had to keep filling the Roman coffers. And the conquered people couldn't make waves. They couldn't revolt. They couldn't have demonstrations. As long as a region or province did those two things, the people there were mostly left alone. Pay your taxes, don't make waves. And if you failed to do either one of those two things, there was usually a battalion of very fierce Roman soldiers not too far away from you that would arrive to put down any revolt or enforce stricter attention to taxation. In fact, that's what's going to happen a bit later in our story, because in 70 CE, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans, and the Jewish people are again cast to the winds, scattered throughout the world in yet another diaspora. Now, I want to be careful here. The practice of syncretism in no way should be seen as a beneficial system for those conquered. Granted, it was far better than the enslavement that some territories, regions, and peoples endured, but syncretism was fraught with all sorts of corruption and violence. We know that the Herods were not good kings. Life in first century Palestine was not easy. Less than 4 out of every 100 persons survived to adulthood. 4 out of 100 survived to adulthood. And if you made it to adulthood, the expectations placed on you were pretty daunting. Get married and raise lots of children to fill the void left by the 96 who died before adulthood, right? And be a useful, tax-paying, non-wave-making, productive member of society. You can practice your traditional religion, that's fine. However, you would have made it much further in Roman society if you adopted their religion. The Jewish people weren't having any of that polytheism. But the Romans let them continue to practice their peculiar monotheistic faith. life was tough for the Jews. It seems that life has always been tough for the Jews. When a people resist against oppression, they're bound to face great difficulty. And the Jewish people have always had to fight for the right to practice their religion because it is this practice of their religion that actually defines them. A Jew is a Jew because they practice their religion, their covenant with God. And to be in covenant with God means to do those things that are Jewish. It's an oversimplification, but I think it serves our purposes here this morning. So first century Palestine, pretty complicated place, isn't it? You were a hardworking Jew, married, trying to raise lots of children, not make waves, not offend your Roman occupiers, and still trying to wrap your head around some relatively new Greek philosophies that were becoming more and more popular with your friends and neighbors. Well, here in just a few short weeks, we're really going to trouble these waters by introducing a radical new philosophy into the mix. An itinerant Jewish preacher by the name of Yeshua. It was Latinized by the Roman occupiers into Jesus. Yeshua is going to start preaching a brand new gospel, a brand new good news, a new way to live your life that circumvents all of this other stuff. Greek, Roman, Jewish even. This radical preacher is really going to mess with Palestinian society, isn't he? But before we get to that story, as I said, we're going to spend the next 2 weeks looking at the particularization of some Jewish practices that help define and separate them from the general public, primarily the ritual of Jewish baptism. That's next week. I want you to take one other thing away with you this morning. If you take anything, I'd like you to take this. Then is not like now. We have a tendency to romanticize history and to say, they were just like us. But a person living in first century Palestine was not just like us. Other than our basic human needs for life, food, water, shelter, and rest, there just wasn't much the same. Familial structures were different. Society was based on different norms. Public and private worship was different. You were probably a slave. Most of the population, there was slavery. But slavery wasn't even what we think of as slavery. Public, private worship, different. Everything was different. I want us to spend some time thinking about these differences more than our similarities because we take for granted Jesus' arrival onto the scene, the drama of his ministry and death. We forget just how radical and resistant and what a rabble-rouser and an activist this man Jesus really was. He was the original X factor, the unknown, the outsider who came to shake things up, to wake up the population, and to make them look at the injustice in the world around them. Injustice that is overlaid upon with all kinds of competing interests. The ghosts of empires, the ghosts of tradition, the ghosts of orthodoxy. In this case, the orthodoxy of the Pharisees that Jesus really liked to trouble with, didn't he? Jesus did not come to this world to maintain the status quo. He came to trouble us. He came to discomfort the comfortable. He came to violently overturn the tables of the temple, to wake us up out of our stupor and to ask a question. You think you belong? You think you're the chosen people? And Jesus would say, really? Are you sure? And then he would turn to those in the margins, prostitutes, the poor, the marginalized, the tax collectors, people that nobody wanted to associate with. We could equate them to the homeless, whatever you want to put that other category. And he would turn to them and he would say, you think you don't belong? Are you sure? I think you belong to the family of God. So we like to think that we know what's what. We look at our bookends that nicely frame our lives and we're comfortable saying we're Christians, but are we really? Jesus wants us to question this. Some of us think we're God's elect, but are we? Do we really belong? And when another Christian in our lives troubles that and wants to challenge our own ideas of Christianity and say, no, you do not belong to the family of God. Well, remember what Jesus is asking us. And look at them and ask them, are you sure? Because I think whatever happened between the words of 2 Chronicles defining priests and everyone else, and the words of 1 Thessalonians, where Paul is trying to define the new Christ followers and everybody else. Somewhere in that tension and complexity remains the truth, the simple truth, that we are all human beings, and we are all created in the image of a God who loves us very much. A God who, I honestly think, cringes whenever we create barriers for full participation in our human family. Anytime we create an us and a them, we diminish God just a little bit. And when we diminish another's claim to common humanity, we don't just deface the other. We're defacing ourselves in that differentiation. So, some important things to think about this first Sunday in Lent. May God, the God who loves us so much and the God whose image we're created in, may that God grant us all eyes to see the others in our presence, ears to hear and really listen to their stories, the stories of our shared humanity, and the courage to act, to create a world where walls and barriers and differences are not only not needed and not wanted, but are actually seen as a defilement of God our Creator. Amen.